Today we are going to explore the brutal and meticulous engineering of medieval castles, structures that were much more than symbols of power. They were war machines designed to turn any attempt at invasion into a disaster with no return. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine yourself before a 12th century castle. At first glance, it seems simply imposing. Colossal stones stacked with a precision that defies time, towers raised against the sky like stone fingers pointed at the horizon. But when studying every detail with the eye of a military strategist, something disturbing reveals itself. Every element of that structure was designed not to impress, but to deter. Not to welcome, but to contain. And above all, not to be conquered. Medieval castles represent one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of human engineering. They were organisms in constant evolution, shaped by centuries of conflict, defeat, learning, and innovation. Every siege that failed or succeeded left a lesson carved into stone, and medieval builders were diligent students of a school where the price of failure could be the loss of an entire kingdom. To understand this engineering, it is necessary to grasp the context in which it flourished. Medieval Europe was a fragmented continent, divided into kingdoms, duchies, and principalities in a permanent state of tension. Land was the most fundamental form of wealth, and control over it determined who ate, who ruled, and who survived. Defending a territory was not a strategic advantage. It was an existential necessity. It was in this setting that the first castles took shape. The most primitive versions, emerging around the 9th and 10th centuries, were simple structures, mounds of compacted earth with a wooden tower on top, surrounded by a palisade. Historians call them motte and bailey castles, a name derived from Norman French describing an artificial mound with an enclosure around it. They were rustic, fragile, but they were what was available at a time when the threat was urgent and resources were scarce. What came next would change the face of power in Europe. With the gradual stabilization of some kingdoms and the accumulation of wealth from trade and the Crusades, feudal lords began to invest in something much more durable, stone. And with stone, everything changed. The transition from the wooden castle to the stone castle was not merely a change of material. It was a philosophical transformation. A wooden castle could be set on fire, but a stone castle, intelligently designed and strategically positioned, was a declaration of intent. The Lord had come to stay, and any attempt to remove him would cost far more than gold. Medieval master builders developed increasingly sophisticated solutions to a central problem: how to create a structure virtually impossible to take by force. This question guided centuries of experimentation. The answers they found are, to this day, objects of admiration among historians and scholars of the art of war, not only for the result, but for the precise reasoning that produced them. The first principle was the most intuitive: the choice of terrain. A castle was not built anywhere. It was sited with discernment: hills, cliffs, river bends, natural islands. Any feature of the environment that made an army's approach difficult was exploited to the fullest. In many cases, the terrain itself was already the first line of defense before a single stone was laid. The attacker who reached the walls had already overcome obstacles capable of exhausting entire troops before any direct confrontation. When nature did not provide what they needed, the builders recreated it. Enormous pits were dug around the walls, some dry as deep, sheer barriers, others flooded with water diverted from nearby rivers, the ditch known as a moat. Crossing this barrier under the cover of archers in the towers was a task few armies could accomplish. But these were only the outermost layers of a far more elaborate system, and it is in this complexity that the true genius of the medieval master builders resides. A castle was not simply a high wall surrounded by water. It was a meticulous labyrinth of architectural decisions, each with a precise purpose, each capable of altering the fate of an entire siege. Throughout this history, each of these decisions will be revealed, layer by layer, stone by stone. Because what these men created was not merely architecture. It was a philosophy of invincibility, carved into limestone and granite to defy the centuries. If the terrain and the moat were the first barrier an invading army had to overcome, what awaited on the other side was even more formidable. The medieval engineers understood something that took centuries to master. A fortress does not defend itself merely by keeping the enemy outside. It defends itself by ensuring that, with every step inward, the cost of that advance becomes progressively higher and harder to sustain. The outer wall, called the curtain, or curtain wall in English, was the second major element of the defensive system. To define it as a high wall would be to underestimate what it represented. A well-built medieval curtain wall was not just a barrier, it was a fighting platform, an instrument of spatial control and a symbol of authority visible for miles. The thickness of these walls amazes even today. In many castles from the 12th and 13th centuries, the walls were between 3 and 6 meters wide at the base. In extreme cases, such as Beaumaris Castle in Wales, built by order of King Edward I of England in the late 13th century, the walls contained internal corridors, staircases, and entire chambers carved within the stone itself. That was not a wall, it was a building disguised as a wall. The height was also calculated with precision. The higher the wall, the less effective the enemy's assault ladders, and the greater the defender's range of fire. But there were limits imposed by the engineering of the time and by the need to keep the structure stable. The balance between height, thickness, and stability was an equation that the master masons solved project by project, adapting each castle to the terrain and the threat it was meant to face. At the top of the walls, the merlons, the projecting blocks that form the crenellated silhouette of castles, existed for a concrete reason: to protect the troops patrolling the wall walk. Between one merlon and the next, the crenels allowed defenders to strike at the invaders and then take cover again behind the stone. The iconic silhouette of a castle, so reproduced in illustrations and films, is not decorative. It is functional in every inch. On the vertical faces of the walls, there was another carefully designed element: the arrow loops. These narrow openings allowed archers to shoot from within with a surprisingly wide field of vision, while offering the shooter almost total protection. The opening was wide on the inside and gradually narrowed toward the outside, creating a generous field of fire for the one shooting and a tiny target for anyone trying to hit from outside. It was geometry applied to survival. But if the wall was formidable, there was one point that concentrated the greatest amount of defensive ingenuity in the smallest space: the entrance. Access to a medieval castle was its most vulnerable point, and precisely for that reason, it was where builders focused their greatest creativity. The entrance tower, known in English as the gatehouse, was often the most complex structure in the entire complex. It all begins with the drawbridge. When raised, it blocked access and sealed the moat. When lowered, it served as a passage, but this passage was never simple. Just after the bridge, the invader would face the portcullis, a heavy structure of iron-reinforced wood that descended vertically along rails fixed in the walls. Operated by counterweight mechanisms, it could be triggered in seconds, trapping any group that had advanced before it could retreat. And there was more. The entrance passage, the stretch leading from the exterior to the inner courtyard, was a corridor of controlled danger. The ceiling contained strategic openings called murder holes, through which defenders positioned in upper chambers could act against invaders who had breached the first barriers. The side walls housed positions for archers, and in many cases the passage was not straight. It bent at a deliberate angle, forcing any advancing group to lose speed and formation before proceeding. Every detail of a medieval castle's entrance turned the invader's advance into a sequence of cumulative obstacles. What made this system brilliant was its interdependence. Suppressing one element did not eliminate the others. The enemy who forced the bridge would still face the portcullis. The one who overcame the portcullis would find the murder holes. Those who survived the corridor would be far from any strategic objective within the castle. It was an architecture designed to deny, to wear down, to make every meter gained cost more than the last. And this, as will be seen in the following pages, was only the beginning of a system whose depth and sophistication still impress everyone who studies it closely. Penetrating the walls of a medieval castle was an achievement few armies attained. But for those who managed it, what revealed itself on the other side was not victory. It was a new layer of resistance, denser and more calculated than the previous one. The master builders of the Middle Ages did not design castles as linear structures. They designed systems of defense in depth, where each internal space had been thought out both to protect the defenders and to weaken any adversary who reached it. One of the most strategic elements of this system were the towers. To a careless observer, they seem merely vertical extensions of the walls, elevated points from which defenders could see farther. But their function went beyond that. Towers were independent fighting positions, designed to be defended individually, even if the section of curtain wall around them had already been taken. If a stretch of the wall fell, the adjacent towers remained functional, armed, and dangerous. The evolution of tower shapes reveals how medieval defensive thinking matured. The earliest towers were often square, forms that facilitated construction but created blind angles, areas that defenders could not cover with fire. The engineers noticed the problem, and over the 12th and 13th centuries began adopting the round tower. With no corners, no blind angles, the round tower offered a continuous line of sight along its entire circumference and was structurally more resistant to projectile impact. In many castles, the towers functioned as independent compartments with their own supplies and reserves. This meant that even after the inner courtyard was conquered, each tower still had to be taken separately, consuming time, resources, and morale. The resistance of a well-designed castle depended not on a single point of strength, but on the sum of all its components working together as a cohesive organism. At the center of this organism, in the most protected position of the entire complex, lay the heart of any medieval castle, the keep, also known by the Norman term donjon, a word that over the centuries evolved into the English dungeon, though its original meaning had nothing to do with dungeons. It was the last fortress within the fortress, the final refuge from which resistance became absolute. With the thickest walls of the entire structure and built upon a raised platform, the keep concentrated the castle's most essential functions: the feudal lord's chamber, the storage of food and water for a prolonged siege, and the archive that ensured the continuity of power. To take it meant to take the castle, but reaching it required weeks or months of siege after overcoming all the previous layers. From the end of the 12th century onward, military engineers developed a concept that would bring the art of defense to its most sophisticated point: the concentric castle. Instead of a single line of walls, these castles featured two or more rings of fortifications, each inner ring higher than the outer one. The logic was devastating. Even if the outer ring was taken, the defenders on the inner ring remained in an elevated position, able to act against the enemies who now occupied the space between the two walls, a space that suddenly became the most dangerous trap on the field. Caernarfon Castle and the aforementioned Beaumaris, both in Wales, are examples that historians cite as the ultimate expression of this principle. Commissioned by Edward I of England in the late 13th century, they represented decades of learning about what worked and what failed in a defensive structure. In them, every detail had been refined by builders who studied castles across Europe and the Middle East, bringing techniques absorbed during the Crusades. There was also an aspect rarely mentioned: the management of internal space. The courtyard between the walls, the so-called bailey, was organized with wells, granaries, stables, and quarters for the garrison. The ability to withstand a siege depended as much on architecture as on internal logistics. An impenetrable wall was worth nothing if the defenders ran out of water after 2 weeks. It is this combination of exterior engineering and interior organization that defines the medieval castle not as a monument, but as a living system, one that breathed, adapted, and learned from every conflict. And the deeper one delves into this history, the clearer becomes a truth that medieval invaders discovered in the worst possible way. A great castle never had a single weak point. It had many strong points, all working in concert, all patiently waiting for the next person bold enough to try. To truly understand the engineering of a medieval castle, one must see it through the eyes of those who faced it. Every architectural decision did not exist in a vacuum. It was a response to something concrete: a siege technique, a war machine, a strategy that had worked somewhere and needed to be neutralized. The castle and the siege evolved together, like inseparable adversaries, each advance on one side provoking an adaptation on the other. The siege, the systematic assault of a fortress, was the most common form of conflict around medieval castles. Contrary to what popular culture portrays, large battles in open fields were risky events that experienced generals avoided. Taking a castle by direct force was even more costly. The siege emerged as the logical alternative. Isolate the structure, cut off its supplies, and wait for time and hunger to do what brute force could not. It was thus that an arsenal of mechanical engines was born, designed to hasten a fortress's fall. The most feared was the trebuchet, a counterweight catapult capable of launching heavy projectiles with force and precision that impress even by modern standards. A well-operated trebuchet could hurl stones of up to 100 kilograms over distances exceeding 300 meters repeatedly for hours. Against poorly built or aged walls, the cumulative effect was devastating. Builders responded ingeniously. Walls began to be constructed with battered bases, with the lower part sloping outward like a ramp. This slope made the base more resistant to impact and caused projectiles that struck the upper portion to ricochet downward toward the attackers themselves. It was a solution that turned the enemy's own force into a problem for them. Another widely used technique was mining, what the medieval era called a mine. The idea was to dig tunnels beneath the foundations of a tower or wall, support the ceiling with wooden props during the process, and then set them alight. Without support, the foundation gave way and the structure above collapsed. It was effective and hard to counter, but not impossible for builders to anticipate. The transition from square towers to round ones was largely driven by this threat. The corners of square towers concentrated the structure's weight on specific points, making them vulnerable to mining. A round tower distributed that weight evenly across the entire base, making undermining far more difficult. Moreover, many castles began to be built on natural rock outcroppings, rendering any attempt at mining unviable from the start. To counter siege towers, large movable wooden structures that attackers pushed against the walls to climb to the defenders' level, builders devised creative solutions. The wall walks were widened, allowing rapid movement between points, and machicolations appeared, projecting stone structures at the top of the walls with openings in the floor through which defenders could act vertically against attackers trying to scale the outer face. Approaching a well-garrisoned castle required far more than courage. The ballista and the mangonel completed the offensive arsenal. The ballista was a giant crossbow, capable of firing projectiles with speed and precision, useful for neutralizing defenders exposed on the battlements. The mangonel was a torsion catapult, simpler than the trebuchet, but effective against auxiliary positions. Against these weapons, besides arrow slits, defenders installed temporary wooden protections over the battlements during the most intense periods of the siege, creating improvised layers atop a structure already designed to resist. What emerges from this continuous clash between offensive and defensive ingenuity is something that transcends engineering. It is a conversation held in stone and wood about the limits of human power and endurance. Each new siege engine was a question. Each new architectural adaptation was an answer. And that conversation lasted for centuries, generating a body of technical and tactical knowledge that still fascinates engineers, historians, and anyone willing to look beyond the stones and see the reasoning that shaped them. What one learns from studying medieval castles is not merely architecture. It is the relentless logic of necessity, the proof that, when survival is at stake, human creativity finds paths where before there were only obstacles, and that the best response to any threat is always the cleverest, not the most powerful. This lesson, built over centuries of conflict and stone, was about to face the greatest challenge in its history. There is a dimension of medieval castles that no architectural analysis fully captures, the human dimension. However sophisticated a defensive system might be, however thick the walls, everything ultimately depended on people. Men and women who had to live within those walls, sustain the resistance for days, weeks, months, and maintain the conviction that the structure around them was stronger than the determination of those trying to tear it down. One of the most surprising discoveries for those who study medieval castles is the small number of defenders these structures required to resist much larger armies. In several documented historical records, garrisons of dozens of soldiers held out for months against armies numbering hundreds or thousands of men. It was not a miracle, it was mathematics. The access points were so narrow that only a few men could advance at a time. The defender multiplied his worth simply by the position he occupied. This reality turned a siege into a war of psychological attrition as much as a material one. For the besieging army, camping around a fortress for weeks was an ordeal of morale. The troops had to be fed and kept disciplined. Time worked against the attacker as much as against the defender. Many sieges that seemed like inevitable victories ended in silent retreats. When the money ran out, the provisions were exhausted, or a threat arose elsewhere in the territory. That is why a castle's internal supply was not a logistical detail. It was strategy of the highest order. The water wells, dug within the defensive perimeter, were perhaps the most critical element of the entire structure. A castle without an internal water source was doomed in days, regardless of the thickness of its walls. Some medieval wells were dug dozens of meters through solid rock to ensure access to the water table, immune to any attempt at poisoning by the besiegers. The granaries and storehouses completed this calculation. A well-stocked castle could hold out for a year or more before succumbing to hunger. Careful feudal lords kept their fortresses stocked for the worst-case scenario. The ability to sustain oneself indefinitely altered the political equation of the conflict. It forced the attacker to negotiate or to commit resources beyond what any conquest could justify. One of the most eloquent episodes of this dynamic is the siege of Rochester Castle in England in 1215. King John besieged the fortress, held by rebel barons with a considerably superior army. The strategy chosen was mining, the undermining of one of the tower's foundations. The operation was successful. The tower collapsed, but the defenders retreated inside and continued resisting for weeks, using an internal dividing wall that separated the two halves of the structure. What should have been a swift defeat turned into a prolonged siege, unmistakable proof of the effectiveness of defense in depth. The castle of Carcassonne in southern France offers another kind of lesson. More than a castle, it was a fortified city, a set of concentric walls that protected an entire population. The towers placed at calculated intervals, the corridors between the two rings of walls turned into control zones, and the multiple gates that fragmented any advance made the city practically invulnerable to conventional sieges. Its history records very few effective conquests over centuries of conflict, but perhaps no example better illustrates the marriage of engineering, strategy and psychology than Castle Gaillard, built by Richard I of England on the banks of the River Seine in Normandy at the end of the 12th century. Erected in just 2 years, an extraordinary time for a structure of such sophistication, it incorporated all the lessons of the Crusades, positioning on a cliff over the river, multiple defensive enclosures, and walls with corrugations that eliminated dead angles. Richard I claimed he could defend it, even if its walls were made of butter. It was hyperbole, but not without foundation. This confidence, common among the feudal lords who inhabited great castles, was not empty arrogance. It was the reflection of a deep understanding that the engineering of their fortresses had been tested and proven over generations. And that confidence had its own strategic value. An enemy who believed a castle was impregnable often gave up before even trying. The reputation of a fortress was in itself a form of defense, invisible, silent, and in many cases more effective than any merlin or moat. For centuries, stone had won. It had conquered fire, wood, steel, and the determination of countless armies. But at the beginning of the 14th century, something began to change. Silently, along the trade routes linking east to west, a knowledge reached Europe: gunpowder. And with it a question no one had asked with such urgency before. How much longer would the stone walls hold? The first medieval cannons were primitive, noisy, and unreliable. At first, the aristocracy who lived in the castles did not take them seriously. Stone had resisted the trebuchet. Why would it yield to a device that often caused more damage to its operators? But the gunsmiths learned quickly. Over the course of the 15th century, cannons evolved into weapons of increasing precision, capable of concentrating force on specific points of walls with a consistency no trebuchet had achieved. And the equation really began to change. The difference between the trebuchet and the cannon was not just one of power. It was a matter of physical principle. The trebuchet launched projectiles in an arc, striking the walls at an oblique angle that allowed some absorption of impact. The cannon fired in a flat trajectory, concentrating all kinetic energy onto a single, nearly perpendicular point. The tall, vertical walls designed to withstand traditional siege became ideal targets for the new weapon. The height that had once been an advantage turned into a vulnerability. Military engineers responded with one of the most radical transformations in defensive history. Tall walls gave way to low, thick, sloping constructions designed to absorb projectiles rather than block them. Circular towers evolved into bastions, angular structures that eliminated dead angles. The ensemble became known as the Trace Italienne, and it marked the beginning of a new era in which geometry returned to the center of defensive design, now in response to a radically different threat. Nevertheless, even with all these adaptations, the medieval castle as a concept had reached the limit of its evolution. Gunpowder didn't just change weapons, it changed the scale and cost of war. Larger armies, equipped with heavy artillery and sustained by nation-states that replaced the old feudal domains, could now besiege and reduce fortresses with an efficiency that made any purely defensive structure impractical. The medieval castle, that war machine which had dominated the European landscape for 4 centuries, began gradually bidding farewell to its primary military function. But here lies one of the most fascinating paradoxes of this story. Medieval castles survived their own obsolescence, not as instruments of war, but as symbols of power, continuity, and identity. Many were transformed into palaces, administrative seats, or monuments. Others were abandoned, left to moss and time, but never forgotten. And today, centuries after the last significant siege, they still stand, drawing millions of visitors who, even without knowing it, intuitively recognize something in those stones. The narrative of an engineering that was, for centuries, the most sophisticated expression of human intelligence applied to necessity. The legacy of medieval castles goes far beyond their stones. It lives in the principles of defense in depth that still guide modern strategic thinking. It lives in the idea that a well-designed system must be redundant, that the failure of one layer should not compromise the whole. It lives in the understanding that terrain, time, and psychology are weapons as powerful as any mechanical device. And it lives, perhaps most surprisingly, in the principles of modern design. The notion that form and function are inseparable, that every element of a structure must justify its existence with clear purpose, finds in medieval castles some of its most perfect and most enduring examples. To look at a medieval castle today is therefore much more than contemplating a relic. It is to converse with centuries of accumulated intelligence. It is to recognize that those men and women who designed, built, and defended these structures had no computers, no simulation software, no materials engineering labs, and yet they created systems that continue to be studied, admired, and taught in the world's most prestigious institutions. If this story has awakened in you the curiosity to look at stone with fresh eyes, then it has fulfilled its purpose. And if you wish to continue exploring the great enigmas of history, science, and human engineering, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment on which aspect of medieval castles surprised you most, because every comment is, like any good fortress, one more stone in this construction we build together.